Let's go! I am literally typing into YouTube FF7 Nintendo. This is sort of a big deal because we already know of this. FF7 Remake is coming to Switch 2. That's cool. But FF7 is the reason that Nintendo and Square Enix had their separation. This game, not this game individually, but this franchise, FF7 as a franchise, is the reason why Nintendo and Square Enix in the 90s had a huge falling out, and they ended up splitting for a lot of reasons, because of the carts, because of disc media, all that kind of stuff. Square and their ambitions sort of like dropped ship from very faithful Nintendo that had been their home for their games for like the longest time, and they went on the new Titanic, which was Sony, and that ship could have crashed, it could have sank, or it could have floated across the Atlantic, but they went that way because they were doing different things. And Sony, I think, also offered Square the opportunity to make more money. Making discs was cheaper than making cartridges because Nintendo like had proprietary ownership of the cartridges or some shit. So because they needed more space for the game, also potentially make more money because discs were way cheaper, they ended up going completely on a business decision. They ended up going to Sony, and Nintendo was mad. Nintendo held a big grudge for a really long time. That was sort of the price that Nintendo paid around this time frame for especially moving into the N64 and not adopting disc media all the way until the early 2000s with the GameCube. And that very much held the N64 back in comparison to a lot of the other experiences that were available at the time, which is why the N64 in some places did really good. But in actuality, the N64 kind of like crashed out. It was not a ridiculously popular system in the same way that Nintendo and the SNES was. FF7's because of that. That all boils down to Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot of like bad blood, and there's a lot of like ancient video game industry rivalry bullshit. And the fact that Final Fantasy VII is literally propagated in a brand new Nintendo video in a brand new way, being released in this way, is some crazy shit to me. Anyway, let's watch this.
私が子供の頃ってテレビ、漫画、やっぱゲームっていうエンターテインメントがあったと思うんですけど、やっぱりゲームって見るだけじゃなくて自分でやっぱ介入できるっていうところがやっぱすごく刺激的な他のエンターテインメントとは違う魅力がやっぱりあって、やっぱそれが子供の頃にすごく
Yeah, FF7 OG was on Switch a long time ago. But funny enough, FF7 OG first showed up on like PlayStation, which was like the PC version. It took a bit of time. It showed up on PS4, and it took a bit of time for the Switch version to eventually happen. The Switch has all the old Square Enix ports now, dude. Pretty much if it's an old Square Enix game, it shows up on a Nintendo platform, and it's no problem because they're old, you know? It doesn't take that much to run them. However, it's no hidden mystery that the majority of like the modern games out there from the big Japanese developers almost entirely skip the Switch, like 95% of the time. There's some exceptions with like, you know, Dragon Ball Fighters and stuff like that. But the majority of them, Dragon Quest, majority of them skip the Switch, dude. So no Final Fantasy 16, no Final Fantasy 15, you know, none of that kind of stuff eventually makes its way. But now it's probably going to be a much different era moving forward.
強烈なインパクトとして残っていて、大人になったら自分もなんかそういうものを作ってみたいなっていうのをやっぱすごく思わされた記憶が残ってて、本当それがきっかけで今自分もこの場にいるんだろうなっていうのは思いますけどね。やっぱり任天堂のハードって私が子供の頃にやっぱ初めて触れたゲーム機でもあるので、今になっても任天堂のハードというのは特別な感情が私の中には。
Of course. Because if he's probably like around our age, all of our collective ages chat, like everybody in the chat is collectively, you know, around his age and around my age. We're all around the same age. So yeah, of course, like Nintendo and PlayStation era RPGs are going to hold a very, very, very big place in like all of our hearts and shit. It's just going to be the natural way it is. Yeah, that's truth.
スイッチ2を初めて見た時はスイッチの上位互換のモデルっていうところにすごく興味を持ちました。 ハンドヘルドのこうタイプと据え置きのタイプを
I have I have met this dude in real life and I've had conversations with him, and we're about a year difference in between when we were born and what we grew up with. So that's how I was able to sympathize with him a whole bunch and have some cool chats with the director of FF7. So yes, we were able to relate a lot on the things we sort of like grew up with and what was neat and what was cool.
こう兼ね備えていて、かつやっぱりこうスペックがこう大幅に上がっていたので、私が作ってる「ファイナルファンタジー7」のリメイクシリーズっていうのも十分ごくパフォーマンスを持っているんじゃないかなっていうところを感じましたので、
He's older than me.
なのでぜひそれであれば参加したいなと思ったのがきっかけでした。開発の仕方も非常にスイッチとこう親和性が高くて、スイッチの開発ノウハウがあればスムーズに開発がこう参加できるっていうのは非常に魅力的でしたし、さらにそのハード自体にも非常に多くのロムのメモリが搭載されているので、開発者にとっては非常に開発しやすいハードになっていると思います。
That's probably one of the biggest friggin' parts of the Switch 2 is that they actually have enough RAM to work with. You know, you start to think about that shit, and it's kind of one of the most stifling elements of this industry, going all the way back to like the PlayStation 2, where they're like, hey, how about you just offset all that RAM usage into, you know, the CPU, and you just make the CPU do all that memory carrying. And they're like, what? And then a very small handful of developers are even able to utilize it in that way. So that kind of like has changed. Now consoles have the appropriate amount of random access memory to get access to even have their games work and operate. So, you know, that's a big deal. That's kind of a big deal to have access to like RAM now that every system has. And clearly, you know, the Switch 1 being developed and created the time it was sort of in that era. Like Switch 1 was being designed around that era where RAM wasn't obviously the biggest deal.
で実際私ももうゲーム開発をしてもう24年経ちますけど、今回初めて任天堂のハードでものづくりをできるっていうところですごく特別な気持ちを持ってますし。
Not to detract from what he's saying, the stories that Sakurai has about how they got Smash Brothers to like even work inside the capacity of one cartridge is crazy. Like what they wanted to include in that game and how they had to manage and mitigate the data. The game was going to be huge. It was going to be 3 cartridges big. Apparently they like wrote a piece of software for the Switch 1 that quite literally encoded down the file sizes of all the music in the game because the music was going to take up way too much space or some shit. So they had some ridiculous ass compression method that they had to create to even make it work. And once they did, they're like, okay, so we can fit a whole bunch of stuff on it. Cool. You know, we don't realize that that's kind of like a huge issue when it comes to some of these systems. It's a big problem.
それがさらに私がこうゲーム業界を目指すきっかけを与えてくれたようなファイナルファンタジー7のリメイクシリーズ。
Damn, is this all running on Switch too? Jesus. Are these Switch 2? They have to be. This has to be native Switch 2 images in the background.
あるっていうことはとても運命的なこう感情を感じています。ファイナルファンタジー7
It looks close to PS4 Pro quality.
プラットフォームで再出発できるということは私にとって非常に大きな意味を持っています。原作の FF7 って1997年にこう発売されて、そこから20年以上こう時が流れてこの FF7 っていうのを再創作することになっているので、その当時のゲームでこう感じた感動とかこう驚きっていうのを今回このスイッチ2を通してもう一回新たにこう上書いてほしいっていう気持ちがあります。今のスイッチ2のスペックであれば実際にこうミッドガルをフルスペックでこう表現することが可能になっています。原作の要素っていうのをこう何でもかんでも変更するというよりかはやっぱある程度原作の要素っていうのをリスペクトして。
Bro, that footage is running at 60, dude. Like, are we uncapping is it like an uncapped 30 to 60? Because that's running at 60 right now. Holy shit. And it's still high res AF, bro. Like, it's still ridiculously high. Cloud looks better in this game. I'm just going to throw it out there. Just making another observation on top of everything. Cloud's face design looks better in part 1 than it does in Rebirth. I love Rebirth. I love it. But for some reason, Cloud looks cooler in this game. And I think that's intentional. He's supposed to be like harder. He's supposed to be like more angsty in this one, which makes him look cooler. And he's a bit softer in the next one because they are literally softening him up, you know, because of the character development. But anyway, moving on. This is very impressive.
And
now it's like back down to 30.
今の時代のハードで表現できるものっていうのを再創作するっていうところを、一番重要視したというふうに考えています。携帯ゲームでプレイできるってことは、それこそまあ会社でも通勤の中の電車の中とかでもプレイできますし、まあそれを持っていってこう今俺ここまで進んだよみたいな、ちょっとこのイベントシーン見てみたいなのもこうやっぱリアルタイムなこう会話ができたりするじゃないですか。まあそういうのはやっぱこれまでなかったので、非常にこう携帯機でのファイナルファンタジーっていうのはすごく期待しています。ゲームチャットについてはゲームをプレイしながらこうチャットだったりとか、
Oh, they have a disclaimer. You need online membership to use game chat.
シェアしたりっていうところで。
Yeah, because you can like actually stream even single player games, right? So that's what he's saying is that if you wanted to like in Switch universe, like in their Nintendo Switch online network, you can stream a game to another person and they can like watch it. That has to run good though. That can't run really bad at like 1440p, 8 frames per second. That can't. It has to look good.
やっぱりこうリアルタイムでこう友達だったりとかとこうシェアできるっていうのは、やっぱ新しいこうゲーム体験につながるかなっていうところを期待しているので、非常に楽しみだなと思います。
There might be a graphics mode and performance mode. Yeah.
FF7 を遊んだことがない人にはまずこうクラウドとセフィロスを知ってもらいたいっていうのがあります。任天堂のスマッシュブラザーズでクラウドとセフィロスって
Damn. Smash mention.
登場させていただいていて、今回このスイッチ2に FF7 リメイクシリーズをこう発表していくことで、こう親子でこうキャラクターのファンになってもらって、なんか語り合ってもらえたりとかすると、まあ、非常に。
Hey, you know what that does? Sorry about all the pausing. You know what that does? That leaves me actually kind of hopeful that if there is another Smash Brothers, yeah, they could return. That if there is a Smash Brothers and it isn't just a pickup off of Smash Ultimate and an expansion to Smash Ultimate, which it should be, but if it isn't, then maybe Cloud and Sephiroth could actually have a spot there. Maybe that's where Tifa's going instead of Tifa and Tekken. But Tifa should be in Tekken. Let's not distract from the real issue here. Tifa should be in Tekken, not in Smash.
嬉しいなというふうに思います。任天堂とファイナルファンタジーのブランドで強いパートナーシップを築いていけることを強く期待しています。
Whoa. Yeah, what was back? Hold on a second. He said something as I was yapping.
こうチャットだったりとかゲーム画面をシェアしたりっていうところで、やっぱりこうリアルタイムでこう友達だったりとかとこうシェアできるっていうのは、やっぱ新しいこうゲーム体験につながるかなっていうところを期待しているので、非常に楽しみだなというふうに思っています。FF7 を遊んだことがない人にはまずクラウドとセフィロスを知ってもらいたいっていうのがあります。
They said like the remake series.
スマッシュブラザーズでクラウドとセフィロスって登場させていただいていて、今回このスイッチ2に FF7 リメイク。
And with that, and with the release of the FF7 remake series on Switch 2, yeah, they're practically not announcing it, dude. He says it at the exact end of the video as well.
で強いパートナーシップを築いていけることを強く期待しています。
Yeah.
スイッチ2で展開される今後のファイナルファンタジー。
Oh, bro, like come on. All right. So that's a soft confirm, right? That's a soft confirm. So why is that important? 2025, this is supposed to come out this year, right? So 2025 possibly comes out this year for Nintendo Switch 2. Remake Part 1, and then possibly 2026 at some point is Rebirth. Hey, Rebirth's coming out. So what's 1 year after that? My dude, is Part 3 going to be launching on everything? Day 1 Nintendo release. Him also saying this, that like, high hopes we can build a strong partnership between Nintendo and the Final Fantasy brand. That's a big deal because that, to me, that indicates, yes, like some sort of console parity. with how the other versions of their games have released. Like, not just the small games, not just like the older games that are being ported. Like, no. Not just like an FF9 port or something. Final Fantasy 17. We're talking Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 3, you know, like as a brand in general. All I'm saying is that Nintendo and Sony and PC getting Final Fantasy 7, if not future Final Fantasy games at launch, is a huge deal. I think the big hopes that I got from this is that Part 3 launches day one on like PlayStation, PC, and Nintendo. Oh, that will be huge, dude. That'll be absolutely huge. And also the future games in the series or other like Final Fantasy-like games, other Square Enix games, Kingdom Hearts, I don't fucking know. Like, I don't care. I don't know. But things like that, having a relationship that lasts on both systems now, where things can exist all over the place, would be incredible. Like, legit would be amazing.